Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Real History. As many of you know, we have been analyzing episode by episode the Apple TV Plus series Masters of the Air, and here, as the grand finale of our analysis, we are joined by none other than the writer and developer of the show, John Orloff. John, thank you so much for joining us here on Real History.
It's a real pleasure. I'm a fan of the channel.
That means a lot, very much so. So I have a handful of questions for you,
Go for
and
it.
I think the obvious one to start off with is how do you, as a screenwriter, make history accessible to the masses?
Wow, that's a pretty big question. Because that's sort of the job in a way, right? Like, I mean, it's like everything I do is trying to do that. Um, it's a really tricky dance to sound authentic, but not too authentic, because if, for example, Bucky Egan sort of spoke in a very Damon Runyon-esque way, which was this book author, the guy who wrote Guys and Dolls.
It is early of an evening, about midnight, when there is nothing much doing anywhere, that I go around to Good Time Charlie's place in West 47th Street.
So if you imagine Guys and Dolls, actually Egan liked to talk like that, and that would have been unbelievable or incomprehensible to modern viewers. So we couldn't do that. So there's just constant figuring things out. Well, do I do this or do I do that? And what's the way to generalize the story but not ruin the story in that generalization? you know I mean, you're almost asking me like, well, how do you describe breathing? It's just kind of like, that's what I do, is what you just asked me. Everything. That's everything. you know
Fair enough. Now, our initial interactions together were somewhat interesting because a few years ago you discovered our channel and started commenting on some of our Band of Brothers breakdowns that we were doing, which like blew us away. It, like amazed us when that happened. Do you generally enjoy engaging with these sorts of online communities and fans of the show? Because I can tell you, it seems fairly atypical for a Hollywood screenwriter to engage with a fan base in that sort of way.
I, yeah, I mean, I enjoy it a lot, and I also, particularly in the Band of Brothers and now Masters of the Air community, um, so many of those people are families of veterans, or people who served. Um, and if you work on something like Band of Brothers, well, almost everybody I know who worked on Band of Brothers, it changed their lives very deeply, me included. And so yes, I mean, also, I don't live in Hollywood. So while I am indeed a Hollywood working screenwriter, I live in Western Massachusetts, where bears get into my car and rip it to shreds, as they did last night. Um, so I don't feel like I have like a Hollywood lifestyle all that much. Um, and I also I'm immensely proud of this work in a different way than anything other work that I've done, because there's a deep educational part to it, and I find it interesting to see people learn, and what did they learn. And I find that really gratifying, because we put so much effort into these things. you know um of course, I can't answer everything, and I can't be, I don't watch all of them, and I don't see everything, and I don't respond to everybody, but I do really enjoy engaging with people about this stuff.
Absolutely. And I think it's so important for people to think of our process that's one that's organic because we're all feeding off of each other in one form or
Yes,
another.
exactly.
And it requires a community to make these things happen.
You
And
have
whether
no,
you're
I mean, you've
a
probably gotten
filmmaker or
some
a park
sense.
ranger or
Yeah,
a teacher, yeah.
sure you've gotten some sense of, pardon me, how many experts, historians, air aficionados, pilots that worked on Masters of the Air. It wasn't, obviously Dale Dye and his team, but there were so many more people in the World War II community, the POW community, the aviation community, the all these communities that we would reach out to and would help us, Um, and yeah, it's all a community.
It's a good way to think about it. Now, you were not a writer for the Pacific. It seemed like you were. There was a lot of crossover between the two series, and an interesting question that somebody posed: would you have done anything differently had you been involved in that? In contrast to what the finished product is.
Well, of course, because I'm a different person, but I love the Pacific. I didn't work on it because I was working on something else, quite frankly, that was taking my time. And I just didn't have the time to commit to it because when you commit to one of these shows, you're all in, man.
Yeah.
You are all in. It consumes your life. And um, so when the Pacific came along, I was asked to join the team. And in fact, at the time, Bruce McKenna, who was sort of the godfather of the Pacific, the earliest guy who was trying to figure it out, he and I shared offices while he
Mm.
was trying to figure it out. So I was sort of present at its birth. Um, and by the time it got to a place where it needed additional writers, which was a couple of years later, I was working on another movie that was in production, and I just couldn't give it the time. I think these shows they're not, they're different. They are
Hmm.
purposely different. Nobody wanted to make Band of Brothers again. We already made Band of Brothers, and it's great, and we all love it, and it's really special, and it's special for a lot of reasons, you know. But that doesn't mean we want to do it again.
Hmm.
And in fact, we couldn't do it again because one of the things that makes Band of Brothers so special, and there are a lot of things, but one of them is the fact that Dick Winters and Carwood Lipton and Millar, they were part of the process in a way that can't be replicated.
Hmm.
I talk to Dick Winters. I talk to these guys all the time for 3 years. What did you feel when this happened? What did you think about that? Would you mind if we make this up? I would ask permission.
Hmm.
There's stuff in episode 9 of Band of Brothers, which was a really hard episode because we knew that we wanted, or I knew, and Tom knew, Hanks knew that we wanted to make an episode that had a lot of conversation about the labor, the slave labor camps, the Holocaust, the concentration camps, and in the book it's a paragraph. So that's all Stephen Ambrose could get out of the guys. So that necessitated me having some long conversations with the major, and then I don't, if I'm repeating myself, I don't know if I've ever told this to you before, but when Nixon goes into the German widow's house, and he's looking for his bourbon or his whiskey, and he breaks the frame, and he feels guilty right? The moment is about we, the Americans, can march into Germany and do whatever we want, right? That's what it's about, right? There are no social rules right now. I am walking into this woman's house, upper middle class, and I am going to steal or take or sleep here. It doesn't matter. And then she sort of reminds him. She reminds him about civilization, and we don't do that. That happened to Dick Winters, not Nixon. That's a true story. And Dick told that to me, and I was like, well, gosh, I think this episode is going to focus more on Nixon. Do I have your permission? Would you mind if I steal that story and give it to Nixon? And he obviously gave me his permission to do that. He was thrilled that there would be an episode dedicated to his best friend. But my point is, we didn't have that luxury on Masters of the Air, and the guys who wrote and women who wrote the Pacific didn't have that luxury on the Pacific. So that, by its very nature, is a reset in why Band is different than the other two programs.
Well, I think you set up my next question quite well for me. Was there something that you would have liked to have kept in Masters of the Air, but it had to be cut? Creative differences? Were there any scenes that come to mind that you thought, oh, I really wish that had stayed in?
I don't want to get into particulars because it's crying over spilt milk. The original scripts were much longer than the finished episodes, sometimes twice as long. And so a lot was cut in the just budgetary process, editing process, just the making of a movie process, the natural way this stuff goes. So yeah, there's tons of stuff. There was a point where there were multiple points. There was one point when I was writing sort of the original Bible, the original vision of what the show would be about 10 years ago. And then equally, when I was like in the middle of writing the first drafts of the script, I had this feeling twice, very deeply, which was, oh, we could make this 30 episodes without losing a beat. There's so much amazing material here and so many amazing men who were in the 100th above and beyond the men you see in our show that all there's so, okay. Actually, here, I will tell this one, because I always think about Big Frank Valesh. So Frank Valesh was a pilot in the 100th. I'm pretty sure he was one of the original. No, maybe he was a replacement, like around Rosie's time. And what's great about him is Frank, he did his 25 and he crashed 7 planes in the process. No, 6. So there was a hang the expense 1, a hang the expense 2, a hang the expense 3, a hang the expense 4, it was, and this guy, like Rosie, just in a different, you would not stop this guy, some of those planes he didn't crash, they were totaled and they came back, unusable. But he did also crash a couple, including, I'm pretty sure it's Big Frank, who was the pilot of the Mile High Club incident. Do you know that incident?
I have heard of that. Yep.
Is it? Do you remember if it's Valesh who was piloting?
I cannot recall.
I think it is Hang the Expense 1, where Frank and if it's not Frank, don't kill me, but I'm pretty sure it is. Took a lass and a friend and another girl into the B-17 in order to go up into the air and do what comes naturally. And he was so in the cockpit, interested in other things, he didn't get liftoff. Reality, not metaphor. He did not get liftoff, and he crashed into Farmer Draper's farm, killing his prized bull, and also I think Hang the Expense was full of fuel and caught fire and was totaled. Everybody got out safely. But he was a secondary character that we sadly had to cut. And at that point, it's like you cut him out totally, because otherwise it becomes a loose thread, and so we had to totally cut out Big Frank.
Yeah, and
but there's like a million of those stories. Say again, I'm sorry.
It must be so hard for you in a creative process to have to trim the fat like that, because you can look at somebody like John Luckadoo.
Oh, I love Lucky.
Or Harry Crosby learning that one of the crews pushed an officer, out of the plane, essentially.
That's not a true story.
Oh, really?
No, that is not a true story.
Okay.
Crosby does have a little bit of a reputation of stretching the truth here and there among the men of the 100th. And I know not only can nobody confirm that story, they all say it's a crock of BS.
Well, I'm comforted to a large extent, to learn that.
But I do think it's representative of a very real feeling he had, at that moment in the war, of frustration and anger and resentment that I am sure it's almost like when he wrote that story, it was like that's what he wished he could have done.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Well, thank you for shedding some light on that element. Another question that I had in conversation with a colleague, to what extent do you, as a writer, have influence on production design, costuming, all of these other elements that make up the series?
Nothing in Band of Brothers. In fact, in Band, I only was on the set for like 2 weeks. Where on Masters, I was a producer and was on set, or at least in England, for the whole show while we were making it. I wasn't on set all the time because I was in a little room writing a lot, not on set, making changes and other whatnots. So I was sort of I was in the conversations, and if I would see something, or I would be copied on the emails, and, if I saw something that like was a red flag for me, I would send out a little note, and sometimes they said, "Oh yeah, you're right." And sometimes there's like a response would be, "Well, there's a reason why we did that." Say Rosie's mustache. I was not in love with Rosie having a mustache, but there was a reason why. And okay, all right, let's move on to the next thing. That happens in a collaborative movie making experience with really talented, skilled people,
Yeah. Well, a while ago, you were on World War II TV with our friend Paul Woodage, who's just a great guy. And while we're talking about things to include and not to include in the creative struggles that happen therein, I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit further on the Tuskegee Airmen subplot to the series. I was a big fan of that from a historical perspective, and I'm wondering when and how and through what means was it decided to incorporate them as something that was fundamental to the storyline?
Soon as, I think, I'm not sure who said it first, but once any of us, Tom, Stephen, me, or Gary, or this other producer, Kirk, once we understood that the Tuskegee Airmen were in Stalag Luft 3 with our main characters, we all like jumped at that um, because I think it's really frustrating to not be able to tell the African American experience because of the segregation. So you can't, I mean, you can't knock Band of Brothers for not having Black people in it, but it's a bummer. You know, we can examine the Italian American, we can examine the Irish American, but what about the African American, the Black man? And so I think we all were like, okay, well, here's an opportunity that we can, you know, bring that story in. And then it was a question of how, because the timing is really complicated. As we all know, they never flew with the 100th. They weren't in England. Um, and so it was complicated from a dramatic standpoint of how do we incorporate them. Pretty quickly, I think I can't remember who first discovered Jefferson. Jefferson wrote a book. It always helps if you got a book, because that's something for us as filmmakers and historians, right? To latch on to and write other books and write movies about, right? That is source material. So Jefferson had written his book, and I'd read extensively about the Stalag. Not a ton of mention of the Tuskegee guys in the Stalag books. I mean, yeah, a little bit, but harder than you'd think. Not a lot of memoirs, you know, from Tuskegee men who were in the Stalags. So not as much information as I would have liked. And then it became about how do we introduce them? When do we introduce them? And really, that was an ongoing conversation. And then, well, if you only show them once they've arrived at the Stalag, then you don't get to see them in action, right? And that kind of seems unfair. And also, it'd be nice if we could see P-51s. So that's how it happened, you know, and that was the reasoning behind what we did. You know, I know some people are like, well, anyway, I don't want to talk about what people think. That's why we did what we did.
Sure. I think historically it works. And I, for one, was glad to hear the likes of Operation Dragoon and other things in the Mediterranean getting a little bit of love because they are so frequently overlooked. So I think it serves as an important appetizer, if you will, to get people their interest piqued in it a little bit further. So I think all in all, it was handled quite well.
I wish we could have had more on them.
Yeah.
You know, we ran out of, we only had so much time. And it was a decision of, well, we either do what we do or we don't do them at all. And there were just too many reasons to do the most that we could.
Yeah. And I think the sort of underhanded way that a lot of the racial friction was depicted in the POW camps, I found that to be true to form. It was there, but it wasn't blatant because there was this realization that we're all in this together.
Yeah, it's
and we have to put that aside.
It's a actually interestingly surprising and, you know, little fact about the war is, with all the racism these guys faced from the majority of their military careers and post-military careers, in the Stalag there was very little of it, at least reportedly so. And the reason being, everybody really had a sense of, oh my God, we're really all in this together, and we just got to get through the day. And everybody is actually pulling their own weight in a really obvious way, you know, and nobody had the energy for it.
Along similar lines, some of our viewers in the UK have wondered why sometimes there's hostility between
I know
American Airmen and RAF guys.
Get over themselves.
I wasn't expecting that among some viewers. So, do you care to speak to that at all?
Yeah, they need to get over themselves, because it was very much existing. Now, they might not like how they portray it. I know there were some people who were a little upset that the RAF guys appeared particularly posh, and therefore that they were, uh, uh, I don't know, not accurately portrayed. And then the other stuff is in Oxford, when Crosby goes to Oxford. Um, I don't know what to tell you. The scenes in Oxford come from Crosby's book. That's what happened to him. Especially in 43, the Brits were not the British soldiers were not that in love with the Americans. The oversexed, over here, overpaid. We had nicer uniforms. They did not like the Americans. I think after or approaching D-Day, I mean, you're a historian, I'm not, but as the Brits sort of understood what we were doing as time went on, I think that attitude softened and changed. But there was resentment, real resentment, especially when the first fight happens, which is I can't remember, but it's spring of 43. Very early days for the Americans to be there in any number. I mean, yes, we were there in 42, but not like we were in 43 when the real Eighth Air Force starts to arrive. And they were not okay with it. They weren't. So I don't know. I don't know what to tell you.
Yeah, I think to an extent it did mellow over time, like you suggest. Um, Especially the fact, to go back to kind of the the subplot in regard to how black troops were treated. A lot of black troops said that they felt more at home in England than what
Right.
they did in the United States. So there was a degree of cordiality. I think especially by 1944, though, immediately before and after, and then onward
Right,
from
exactly.
D-Day.
And once like we were sharing blood literally in the
Mm,
foxholes together,
yeah.
I think it was a different sensibility
Yeah,
between
no,
the
I think that's
the,
a very
the
fair point.
nations.
To switch back to Band of Brothers just for a little bit, do you think that the team would have written or composed things differently had the internet been as robust as it was in the late
Well, we would have
1990s
had
and
less
early 2000s?
errors, I mean, obviously, like the famous Blythe error, that's literally an error because nobody thought to double check what the men of Easy Company told us directly.
Hmm.
They all thought Blythe died of his wounds. And so, if Lipton tells you, well, I'm pretty sure he died, when he got home, that's what I heard. And you hear that a couple of times, and there's no way to double check it. Um, yeah, of course, but I don't think that much because our guiding light was obviously the book, but the guys. I mean, again, I can't underscore how much we talked to the men. The
Hmm.
writers did, though the survivors, the guys that were alive at 1999. And that's one of the reasons why they're major characters.
Hmm.
Bull Randleman, Compton, Malarkey. Like I said before, I can go through the guys who were alive. Those tended to be the more on camera people because we knew their stories the best and we could express them the best.
And I just exhibited how easy it can be to fall into the trap of taking somebody at their word, as with Harry Crosby, as
Yeah.
as we just demonstrated. So yeah, I think it's human to do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I really appreciated about Masters of the Air was the inclusion of ground personnel. Uh, and I'm very good friends with a B-24 co-pilot who is now 100 years old, who's named John Homan, and he's really looking forward to watching the series. And he said, you know, we get all the glory, we get all the laurels, but it was the mechanics drinking cold coffee and eating cold sandwiches out in the rain who really did, who really made everything possible. And that that theme is encapsulated in Ken Lemons
Right.
in
Exactly.
such a pure and evocative way, I think.
Well, that
Can you,
comes. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, can you speak to the process of how you sought to include characters like Ken Lemons in the process and why you thought that was so fundamental?
When I originally read Don Miller's book, it's obviously a very big book. A lot of people are mentioned in that book. Um, and he mentions Ken Lemons. So that's how I learned about Ken. And I'm pretty sure the wheel well incident is in Don Miller's book. And but Don didn't have Ken Lemons' self-published war memoir. He only had one chapter Xeroxed and he couldn't remember where he
Mm,
got it. And it was only that one chapter.
I've been there.
And but I was obsessed. I was like, I got to know more about this guy because that that was enough for me to go, okay, we need to tell a whole story about this guy in the whole show. Because the other thing I was looking for were characters that could be in the whole show. Because remember, our two main characters, Buck and Bucky, are shot down, in episodes 4 and 5, and Rosie, they've just met him, right? So it was weird. How do you keep a foundation of Thorpe Abbott's? And so Crosby is one of those. Crosby is, as far as I can tell, the only, or one of, but I'm pretty sure the only guy from the original 36 crews that showed up in June of 43
Mm.
who is still at Thorpe Abbott's in VE Day, by VE Day. Everybody else is shot down, dead, tour of duty ended, gone home. And that's hard when you're making a television show because everybody's coming and going. I mean, I know some people feel that that's a problem with Masters of the Air, that people come and go. That is the reality of what happened. And there's this constant drama, there's this constant conversation we're all having between drama and history. And that was one of the things that historically had to be correct to all of us. That, yeah, in almost 2 years of service, the 100th saw 3,000 airmen or something go through there, and guys were shot down and other people had to pick up the yoke, as it were. And we wanted to show that, but you also need some sort of foundational consistency. So Lemons and Crosby are those people. And I found on eBay, it was before anybody obviously knew anything about, because this is 9 years ago, before anybody knew that we were making the show. And there was a copy of, like, he only printed like 300 or 400 or something.
Yeah, 500 of them. Yeah.
And I got one, and that's why it's in the show, um, and I'm thrilled that we were able to show both the navigator position in a important light and the ground crewman in a important light,
Yeah, and it's beautiful in a way that how this ant farm, if you will, is all stitched together. The cooks, the crews, the chaplains, the military police, the mechanics. It
Catch this. I mean, I don't know if you caught this, but so in episode 1, the chaplain goes up and says, I'm here if you need me. And everybody's a little like, yeah, sure, whatever. I'm 20. I'm going to live forever. and there's an exterior shot as they're all getting into the Jeeps, and he's out in the church, and he's kind of in the background, and Egan is watching everybody leave, and nobody's there at church, right? But by episode 3, they all want to be blessed before they get into that airplane.
Yeah.
You know, there's little things that people might not notice for a few viewings. you
Yeah.
know?
And that is so accurate because chaplains wrote about that in their letters home, that when they were at stateside bases, they'd only have 10% of the church full, but once they got overseas, 3/4 of the church was full. So it's a very good little detail to incorporate. And just going back to Lemons again, real quick, the producer of our channel, Andy Collins, was a heavy vehicle mechanic in Iraq. And, you know, as he and I have talked about historical films and war films over the years, he said that nobody is ever going to make a movie about me, you know,
Oh.
the mechanic. And this movie finally did that. This series finally did that. And so I can't tell you how important that was to him to see somebody with a wrench rather than a rifle out there.
And being a real hero.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
So
that means a lot to
thank
me,
you on
actually. So
behalf
thank you
of
for sharing
our
that.
producer, Andy.
Well, thank you for sharing it. It means a lot to me, actually.
I'm glad. I'm glad. On a lighter note, before we start to wrap things up, one of the things that's been theorized the most about the show is the character of Bob in episode 4, and we've heard all sorts of theories as to how and why he is picked out by the Resistance as
Oh.
an infiltrator.
Oh man, that actually is not a scene that I wrote. So that was sort of an extemporaneous scene by the director.
Okay.
So you would have to ask him, you know.
Very good. Well, there were all sorts of theories, so I thought I would give it a try.
Wasn't it the date backwards or the
Yeah, the
I
date
can't
was written
remember. I can't
in
remember.
European fashion.
Yeah.
He had a German cigarette lighter.
Well, so there you got a few of them then. I think any of those theories work.
Yeah,
That's what I mean. Like that was the stuff that the director, sort
Yeah.
of.
Yeah. He didn't have any injuries like the other two. So
Right.
yeah, I thought I'd give it a try to fulfill people's curiosity. The final question or two that I have for you, as you said, Masters of the Air consumed a decade of your life. For all intents and purposes, you were probably the best versed person on the 100th Bomb Group, in the same way that you were probably the best versed person on the battle for Breakcourt Manor. What has the transition or that personal journey been like?
It's hard. After that was another reason why I didn't participate in the Pacific. It was I was busy, but these shows are very emotionally draining because you're writing about real people who suffered in really horrible ways often. And that's a dark place to be for a long time.
It's a great point.
Because every day you wake up and you start typing, and it's not like you're writing about Darth Vader, killing 2,000 rebel people in a spaceship that don't exist. Instead, in the case of Masters, every time I wrote about a plane going down, it's a real plane going down. Those aren't made up planes that are going down in any of the episodes. I mean, like, for example, in episode 1, we name Petrick, Schmallenbach, and Adams. Well, those are the real pilots of those 3 planes that really went down. And there were versions of that script where we actually, well, not act, but where we knew those men a lot better. That didn't make it into the final episode for whatever dramatic reasons. But I know who all these guys are. In episode 3 in Regensburg, you, the audience member, might just see a plane going down behind Buck Cleven's plane, but that is not just a plane going down behind Buck Cleven's plane. That might be Holland. I don't know who. I can't off the top of my head remember all the planes that went down in Regensburg, but we all tracked it. Like, it wasn't a random plane.
Yeah.
And, I'm reminded of in Regensburg, when the guy hits the wing, that really happened. There's some versions where that's what's happened to Bidik and Bidik's co-pilot. That's where that comes from. There are different versions of what happened when Bidik went down. There's one version where he saves a little German town as he's coming down. There's another version where there's an oxygen fire in the cockpit, and both Snyder and Bidik crawl out of the side of the cockpit, and I think it's Snyder who gets cut in half by the rear stabilizer. Well, we ended up not showing that version because we wanted to show Bidik having like this last moment of bravery. And there was a version of that, right? The other eyewitnesses said, well, he saved a town by, ditching the plane and not crashing into the town. And so that was the version we decided to do. But we also wanted to keep that imagery of somebody being, it was a 3-dimensional war theater, not a 2-dimensional one, like in an infantry battle, it's basically left, right, it's 2 dimensions. In the air, it's, 3 dimensions. And it wasn't just bullets that were in 3 dimensions, there were men and material. And what would happen is there was a slipstream. And so in the slipstream, the stuff doesn't fall. It's sucked into the slipstream because there were so many airplanes. So the damaged parts of airplanes didn't just fall. It took them a long time to fall because they get stuck in the slipstream, and so would people. And we wanted to show that. But so there's a long way of saying, writing that every single day, there is no comparison to what these men went through and what their commanding officers went through, but I can feel a tiny bit of why Hugland got an ulcer and why Harding, couldn't do it anymore. I got a little feel for that because I was writing about their men going down and going down and going down and going down. And yeah, I'm ready for a break from that.
Yeah.
So
rightfully earned.
I'm trying to figure that out. I definitely know I'm not going to be returning to anything like this for the near term. Yeah.
Oh, you've earned your stripes.
Thanks.
When considering these stories, when you were either meeting with veterans or meeting with their families at premieres or perhaps even during interviews like this, does a moment come to mind, especially with Masters of the Air, where the impact of your work has truly hit home?
Not so much with Masters, because I broke my ankle 8 weeks ago. So I've been pretty, and badly, like in 3 places, surgery. So I've been in bed and pretty immobile. So I have not had a ton of interaction since sort of the show really kind of was midway done. I do with band because I have a 23-year history of meeting veterans, and so many veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan watched band from day one of band existing, and have been really meaningful to people. And I've had amazing interactions with veterans and their families about band, and but I just haven't had that opportunity with masters. I mean, yes, I've spoken to Lucky Luckadoo, who is one of the most amazing men I've ever had the opportunity to meet. He ants, I've known him for about 9 or 10 years now, because I would call him up when I had a pilot question, a B-17 pilot question. He was the first person who finally said, "Oh yeah, we peed in a bucket." Because that's not in the books very much, but I'm humbled by Lucky, and Lucky's, he he's a tough character, he's a tough guy. But I think he's pretty happy with the show. So that's really the only interaction I've had with any of the vets, from the 100th, who've like seen the whole show. So I can't comment yet. I think I do know, because I have some friends in the Air Force that I've met during this process of making this show. And I do know the Air Force guys and girls, women, I should say, men and women, are really excited that they have one of these shows to sort of talk about now.
Yep. Well, I suspect there will be many compliments and kudos to be paid in the future as you heal up and you get out there again.
Well, thanks. I'll try to heal, that is. Keep the bears away as well.
Before we conclude, do you have any closing or additional thoughts of anything that we didn't get to cover in our conversation today?
Gosh, no. Do you?
I would just like to thank you again for your body of work in this regard, because it's very easy for historians and air buffs to nitpick, but they often do so without any realization of the complexity that it requires to stitch these sorts of things together. And this series, as is the case with its two predecessors, I think you treated it with the grace and dignity, and even when things had to be condensed or compacted or altered ever so slightly, I never felt like that there was an untrue moment in the series. And I think that is its ultimate sign of success. So I thank you and your team for giving us yet another cinematic legacy to what was achieved during the Second World War years.
Well, we tried really hard. Everybody who worked on this show really just gave it their all. So thank you for those kind words.
John Orloff, writer of Masters of the Air, thank you so much for joining us on Real History.
My pleasure.
All right, folks, we'll see you next time. In the meantime, leave a comment below, hit that subscribe button, and until we do see you next time, stay curious.